Chicago, 1893. The city was alive, a machine of progress, invention, and noise. The air shimmered with ambition. The world's Columbian Exposition had transformed the city into a stage for the future. But just a few blocks away from the fair's glittering lights, something unspeakable was being built. It looked like an ordinary hotel, 3 stories of brick and promise. But those walls hid more than rooms. They hid screams. This is the story of the Murder Castle, a place designed not for hospitality, but for horror. And at its heart, a man who looked more like a gentleman than a killer, a doctor, a businessman, a charmer. His name was Herman Webster Mudgett, but the world would come to know him as H. Holmes, America's first serial killer. You think you've heard this story before, but you haven't heard it like this, because this isn't about how he killed, it's about how he built death into architecture. Before the castle came the charm, Holmes wasn't born a monster, he grew into one, layer by layer, lie by lie. Born in New Hampshire in 1861, Herman Mudgett was a quiet child, too quiet. He was intelligent, meticulous, obsessed with anatomy. He spent his youth dissecting animals, not out of cruelty, but curiosity. That curiosity would later rot into something darker. He was bullied relentlessly, mocked for his intelligence. They say once, to cure his fear of skeletons, his classmates forced him to stand before a human skull, its hollow eyes staring back into his own. He didn't flinch. He smiled. That moment, that merging of fascination and fear, never left him. He would spend his life trying to recreate it in others. Holmes studied medicine at the University of Michigan, where he learned not just anatomy, but deception. He stole cadavers from the lab, mutilated them, and staged accidents to collect insurance money. Death became a tool. Fraud became an art. He was brilliant and utterly soulless. He left behind a trail of unpaid debts, abandoned wives, and lies that shifted with every new town. But in Chicago, he found something he'd never had before. A stage big enough for his ambitions. The city was booming. Construction filled the air with dust and opportunity. He changed his name to Dr. H. Holmes. It sounded respectable, clean, almost noble. He opened a pharmacy on the corner of South Wallace Avenue, the first step toward his empire, and then he began building the castle. Sound, hammering, sawing, muffled voices. Wind whistling through half-built walls. On paper, it was a hotel. In reality, it was a labyrinth. Holmes hired builders who didn't ask questions. When they did, he fired them. Each team constructed only a piece, never the whole. No one but Holmes knew the full layout. He designed the building himself, and what he drew was madness disguised as logic. Narrow, hallways that led nowhere, doors that opened to brick walls, staircases that ended abruptly at ceilings, and rooms that locked only from the outside. There were hidden chutes that dropped straight to the basement, gas pipes that snaked into guest rooms, controllable from a secret panel in Holmes's office, soundproof vaults lined with iron, and an incinerator large enough to burn bodies to ash. When construction finished, the neighborhood marveled at the building's grandeur. They called it Holmes's Castle. They didn't know it was built to trap souls. When the World's Fair began in 1893, tourists poured into Chicago, naive, hopeful, dazzled by progress. Holmes welcomed them with a smile. Women traveling alone were his favorite guests. He offered them rooms at discounted rates. He was charming, gentle, and polite, the perfect gentleman. And then they vanished. No one suspected him. Chicago was chaotic. People went missing all the time. The fair drew millions. The city swallowed them whole. But inside Holmes's castle, each disappearance had a method, a plan. He would lure them upstairs under the pretense of showing them their room. Once inside, The door would quietly click shut. A faint hiss would fill the air, gas seeping through hidden vents, and when the sound stopped, the room went silent. Holmes would watch. Sometimes through peepholes he'd carved into the walls, other times through a mirror that wasn't really a mirror. He watched them die, calm, detached, studying the process like an experiment. To him, death wasn't horror, it was efficiency. When the guests were gone, the chutes came to life. Bodies dropped through metal shafts that led straight to the basement. Down there, Holmes became the surgeon again. He dissected his victims, carefully, precisely. He stripped flesh from bone and sold skeletons to medical schools. Even in death, they were profitable. Everything about his crimes was transactional. Every scream, every breath, every lie. And still, the city went on, laughing, drinking, celebrating progress while its first true monster moved among them unnoticed. Not all his victims were strangers. Some were women who loved him. Clara, his first wife, abandoned. Myrta, his second, deceived. Georgiana, his third, used for her innocence. And then there was Julia Smythe, a married woman who worked for him. She fell in love with Holmes and left her husband for him. But when she demanded marriage, Holmes promised it, on one condition, that he could perform a medical procedure on her first. She never left the castle again. Then came Emmeline Sigrand, a secretary, bright and curious. Holmes told her he needed her help testing a new, airtight vault. When she stepped inside, he locked the door. Gas filled the room. He watched through the glass until the last sound faded. This was how he loved, with ownership, with control, with destruction. Holmes's castle wasn't just a place. It was a reflection of his mind. Each room mirrored a part of him. The hallways, his lies, the locked doors, his secrets, the furnace, his guilt. Burning endlessly, consuming everything. He created a building that breathed death the way he breathed lies, and as the fair continued, the castle devoured more and more. Some were guests, some were employees, some were lovers. All of them ended the same way, silence beneath the floorboards. By the end of 1893, the World's Fair closed. The lights went out, but in Holmes's castle, darkness stayed. The neighbors noticed fewer visitors. The smell of burning, the strange sounds at night. But no one questioned Dr. Holmes. He was too polite, too refined, too impossible to suspect, until one man, Benjamin Pitezel, stepped into his life. And that was the beginning of the end, because Pitezel wasn't just another accomplice. He would become Holmes's final victim, and the key to his downfall. Soft pause, slow fade of ominous music. But that's a story for part 2. When the castle begins to reveal its secrets, and America meets the devil in human skin, would you like me to begin? Part 2. The downfall, arrest, and legacy of the murder castle. Now, it'll continue in the same cinematic tone. The investigation, the shocking discoveries inside the castle, and Holmes's chilling confession before his death. Perfect. Let's continue the darkness. Here's Part 2 of your 10,000-word cinematic voiceover script for your torture history video. When Benjamin Pitezel first met Holmes, he saw opportunity and not danger. He was a carpenter, an inventor, a man desperate to make something of himself. Holmes offered him a partnership. Together, they'd build success. But Pitezel didn't realize what kind of architect Holmes really was. He didn't build with wood and brick. He built with lies and corpses. At first, Holmes used Pitezel as muscle, a man who could forge documents, run errands, sign false names. The two scammed insurance companies, selling fake inventions and renting rooms to imaginary guests. And all the while, beneath their feet, The castle continued to whisper its secrets, but every devil needs a witness, and Pitezel had seen too much. By 1894, the fair had ended. Tourists were gone. Money was drying up. Holmes was restless, desperate for one last perfect con. He convinced Pitezel to fake his own death. They would stage an explosion, burn a body beyond recognition, and claim the life insurance. Holmes promised to pay Pitezel's wife the money and split it between them later, but Holmes had no intention of sharing. In September 1894, in a rented office in Philadelphia, Holmes put his plan into motion. He brought Pitezel a bottle of chloroform and told him to relax. When Pitezel fell unconscious, Holmes covered his face and waited. Minutes passed. The body went still. Holmes then poured more chloroform directly on the corpse, not to kill, but to fake the cause of death. He left the room calmly, locking the door behind him, and when police arrived, they found what looked like an accident. Holmes collected the $10,000 insurance claim, but Pitezel's family was still alive and waiting. Holmes told them Benjamin was hiding and that he'd take them to him. He took 3 of Pitezel's children on a train. Only one would survive the journey. Holmes traveled with the children across cities from Chicago to Indianapolis, Detroit, and Toronto. Each time he rented new rooms under new names. Neighbors described him as kind, even fatherly, but behind those calm blue eyes, something cold stirred. He told the children stories that their father was waiting for them, that they'd see him soon. He bought them sweets, toys, dresses, and when night came, he locked their doors. In Indianapolis, one of the girls, Alice, began asking questions. She didn't believe him anymore. She missed her mother. She wanted to go home. Holmes smiled gently. "You'll see your father soon," he whispered. The next morning, Alice and her sister Nellie were gone. Weeks later, in a rented house in Toronto, police would find 2 small bodies buried beneath the basement floor, their faces blue, their lips sealed with chloroform. Holmes had killed them the same way he'd killed their father, not out of rage, not for pleasure, but simply to eliminate loose ends. Holmes kept moving. Boston, Cincinnati, St. Louis, changing names, changing stories, but for the first time, he was being followed. Detective Frank Geyer, assigned to track the missing children, began piecing together the trail. He retraced Holmes's path, the fake names, the letters, the empty houses that smelled faintly of gas, and at the end of that trail, he found the graves. It was over. Holmes was arrested in Boston in November 1894, not for murder, but for insurance fraud. He was polite, articulate, almost charming during questioning. He told police he was innocent, but when investigators searched the castle back in Chicago, the truth began to seep through the walls. Sound. Doors creaking open. Echoing footsteps in hollow hallways. Detectives entered the castle expecting a crime scene. What they found was a nightmare. Rooms without windows, vaults, with scratch marks on the inside, hidden pipes connected to gas lines, a large furnace in the basement, filled with fragments of bone, melted jewelry, and the twisted remains of corsets. The walls still smelled faintly of decay. There were surgical tables, blood-stained tools, and quicklime barrels used to dissolve flesh. It was an industrial slaughterhouse disguised as a hotel. The newspapers called it the Murder Castle. And yet, even with the evidence, no one could count his victims. Some said 9, others 50. Holmes himself claimed over 200, but the truth was more terrifying because no one could prove how many the castle had swallowed whole. In 1895, H. Holmes stood trial in Philadelphia for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. He defended himself, speaking with the confidence of a man giving a lecture, not facing execution. He described his crimes with the calm precision of a surgeon explaining anatomy. When the jury found him guilty, he didn't protest. He simply nodded, as though he'd expected it all along. But before his hanging, Holmes did something no one expected. He confessed. In a written statement, he said, "I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer. No more than a poet can help the inspiration to sing." He claimed his facial features were changing, his head elongating, his eyes sinking deeper, his body transforming into something inhuman. The press called it madness, but others whispered that the devil had finally come to collect. May 7th, 1896. Philadelphia's Moyamensing prison. Hundreds gathered to watch the hanging of H. Holmes. He walked calmly to the gallows, dressed neatly in black. No fear, no regret. He shook hands with the guards and smiled at the priest. When the hood was placed over his head, he whispered, "I am ready to meet my fate." The trapdoor fell, but Holmes didn't die instantly. His neck didn't snap. He twitched and convulsed for nearly 20 minutes before finally going still. Even in death, he refused to die like a man. Holmes's body was buried 10 feet deep, encased in cement. As per his request, he said he didn't want grave robbers stealing his body for dissection, but some believe he feared something else entirely, that the devil might take back what was his. Years later, the castle mysteriously burned to the ground. Locals claimed to see figures moving in the windows before the flames consumed it. No one was ever caught, and yet, even today, that block in Englewood carries a heaviness, as if the earth itself remembers. Some say at night, you can still smell the faint scent of smoke and iron. Others swear they hear footsteps where the hallways once were. Holmes's castle is gone, but the blueprint of his madness remains. H. Holmes was more than a killer. He was a builder of illusions, of fear, of a new kind of evil that America had never seen before. He turned progress into a weapon. He took the optimism of the industrial age and filled it with gas, blood, and lies. Every locked door he built was a promise. That human cruelty can be designed, that a house can become a mind, that the line between man and monster is thinner than brick. So when you walk past an old building and feel a chill for no reason, remember the man who made walls breathe, death. Remember the castle, and remember that the devil doesn't always live in the dark. Sometimes he rents rooms by the night. If this story left you haunted, remember, history's darkest rooms are the ones we keep locked in our minds. Subscribe to Torture History and step inside them with us again.